We had a visit earlier.
If I was at church, I'd ask everybody to move toward the front. You know, but so welcome everybody to the second Global Security Distinguished Lecture. I'm your host, Jim Novak. I'm the director of UNM's Global and National Security Policy Institute. I'm delighted to resume our community-based programming and delighted to see the interest from the community. Thank you all for being here. The Global and National Security Policy Institute, GNSPI, was established to educate future leaders who will develop effective and sustainable global and national security policies that address the interdependence of technology, environment, economies, societies, standards of living, and cultures. We maintain a broad definition of national security issues, ranging from nuclear weapons and non-proliferation, climate change, natural resources, cybersecurity, humanitarian challenges, as well as governance, legal, and ethical concerns. Policy decisions regarding security cannot be made in national isolation. One country can't define their own security through their unilateral actions. Our students, for example, will study the interdependency of energy decisions with security decisions, and one of the case studies they'll look at is the issue of Germany right now, where in the 90s they abandoned nuclear energy, a non-CO2 emitting technology, in favor of buying Russian fossil fuels. So one of the things that the students will be looking at is how that happened, what the culture was, and how they're going to deal with that situation as winter comes on this year. Other global security issues are arguably existential. Climate change is one of those that is existential for the planet. Our CO2 emissions are rising, but no one country's unilateral actions can really impact that. There needs to be a global consensus on how we can reduce our CO2 emissions in order to bring that back in line. And so in these cases, we need to have each nation have a policy that complements the others. And that's something that has been done before in some of the more, for example, in NATO or other places like that with military action, but we've never done it with environmental types of actions where we have this tragedy of the commons type of situation where one abuser of the commons can dominate or can impact the whole thing. So the Global and National Security Policy Institute brings together interdisciplinary researchers from UNM. It brings together staff members and researchers from the federal labs in order to educate students in how to think systematically about security policy in this context of the interdependence and then the dissemination of technology. Since 2019, GNSPI has graduated 108, or has awarded 108 undergraduate certificates and concentrations, and we've awarded 30 professional masters of science in global and national security. Even though we launched GNSPI just before the pandemic, we've had a remarkably successful start. I want to particularly take a quick moment to thank the faculty and staff that persevered through COVID with us and the shutdowns. We continued working, graduating students, educating them, and I want to thank my predecessor, Emil Nakala, for kicking this all off and starting this wonderful institute at the University of New Mexico. We couldn't have done this without our partnerships from the federal labs, including the Air Force Research Lab, Los Alamos National Lab, and Sandia National Labs in particular, who's a co-sponsor of this lecture series. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce Sandia National Laboratories Associate Lab Director, Deborah Franke, for her welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Jim. You know, I just have to pause a moment. Every time I do something in person these days, I just reflect with gratitude and get a big smile on my face. So apologies, but it's just such fun to look at and see actual human beings in the same room together with me. So also especially fun is that it turns out Jim and I had known each other in a previous life, and so I've gotten to not only meet Ms. Napolitano in person and spend a little more time with her than the last time I saw you, just I think in a receiving line a long time ago, but to have a chance to chat. And then to get back to the purpose of this meeting, so one of the reasons behind this lecture series when it was formed, I guess in 2019, was to try to increase community awareness and understanding of the importance of what we do together in global and national security. And so it is really amazing to be partnering with the University of New Mexico and to be able to come together and talk about it again. And having Ms. Napolitano here as really the kickoff of the restart is perfect. I was asked to say a few words about Sandia, and I'll try to keep them down to a few. I know, yeah, because I really also want to hear what Ms. Napolitano has got to say to us. But what I really love about Sandia is its mantra of exceptional service in the national interest. And one of the things that makes our nation so special is that we've not only invested in a wonderful educational system and all that you've heard about now in New Mexico and in other institutions, UC system, which I was a product of, again, as a nod to some of your past history, in the way that we educate and train students, we also have these wonderful national laboratories that are repositories for so much knowledge and that provide so much operational support to our mission. So Sandia itself launched about 70 years ago with a focus then through the Manhattan Project on the nuclear deterrence mission. Strong and important, and many things I can't talk about in this room, went on at that laboratory in that regard, and it expanded, though, over time to have a much more comprehensive issue because the national security issues have become much more complex and intertwined. So now if you look at Sandia, it not only has the contributions that we've made in the past to nuclear deterrence, but it's expanded dramatically. So the area that I'm privileged to lead, national security programs, we've got hypersonics, we've got cybersecurity, we do work in microelectronics, so we have the largest governmental fab on our site, and you know how important some of those things are. We do a lot of work in support of the non-proliferation mission, and all of that, the ramifications there. We also have global security, so we look at that deterrence factor. How can we make sure that proliferation is not happening unawares? And that encompasses everything from the ground to the sky, space being a critical piece of that. Energy, Department of Energy National Lab, you would expect we'd be doing something in energy. And we have vibrant programs there, and I think, Ms. Napolitano, you've seen some of what we do in climate. Others, you might want to take a look at that. But energy security is broader than just simply the climate, although that's critical. But we also have things that might be used for conservation and our own internal uses. And then, of course, there is the relationship with the local community, where we work, again, I think, hypersonics, cybersecurity, peace engineering, some very interesting programs. So with that, I'll stop and turn it back over to University of New Mexico to continue. But again, thank you for coming. You're interested in national security. And Ms. Napolitano, thank you so much for being with us for the relaunch of this program.
Thank you, ALD Franke. And now I'd like to introduce UNM President Garnet Stokes for her comments.
So good evening, everyone. It is really a pleasure. I feel the same way about being in front of people again. I still haven't gotten over how much better it is. We are at UNM really delighted to partner with the Sandia National Laboratories to bring in distinguished leaders to share with our community their thoughts about global security issues. And that starts with you. Thank you so much for your comments, for your continued partnership. In so many ways, we really appreciate the work that we're able to do with Sandia and for the ongoing support that we have. The Global and National Security Policy Institute and this lecture series are elements of the UNM 2040 strategic framework, under which we work to build a healthier, better educated, and more globally engaged New Mexico. The University of New Mexico is proud to create opportunities to advance our state, to focus on the student experience and innovation within our educational enterprise, build on the strength of our diverse cultures, establish an operational model that is environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable, and more fully integrate our activities as one university. Suffice it to say, though, that that's hard work. But fortunately, we have a lot of help. UNM is uniquely situated, perhaps more than any flagship university in any state in the country. And why is that? Well, we do have in our backyard not one, but two NSA labs, as has already been mentioned, Los Alamos and Sandia. We're right next door to Kirtland, and we have the Air Force Research Laboratory. These engineering, science, and technology institutions are huge for New Mexico and are important aspects of economic development in our state. And through it all, Sandia has been a great partner. We're proud, for example, to be part of the Sandia Academic Alliance, which strengthens research collaborations, particularly in fields of science and technology. We also work together on our really remarkable Lobo Rainforest, a collaborative ecosystem that nurtures innovative teamwork between UNM students and faculty and our colleagues at Sandia to come up with the inventive solutions to big problems. There's also our Applied Materials Lab, another cutting-edge facility bringing UNM students, faculty, and Sandians together in shared spaces to work on common problems. And of course, there's our Global and National Security Policy Institute, which extends UNM's mission to educate students in becoming leaders in national security policymaking, an expertise that directly complements the science and technology missions of New Mexico's laboratories and government agencies. As part of our work together at the Institute, we get to host terrific events like this one tonight. Tonight it is my honor to welcome our speaker, the Honorable Janet Napolitano. Janet Napolitano is a professor of public policy at the Goldman School of Public Policy and the founder and faculty director of the Center for Security and Politics at UC Berkeley. She previously served as the 20th president of the University of California, which of course is the nation's largest public research university. Appointed by President Obama in 2009, Professor Napolitano served as Secretary of Homeland Security through 2013. She is a former two-term governor of Arizona, a former Attorney General of Arizona, and a former U.S. Attorney for the District of Arizona. In 2019, Napolitano published a book titled, How Safe Are We? Homeland Security Since 9/11. And most recently, in 2022, President Biden appointed her to the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. Professor Napolitano earned her bachelor's degree summa cum laude in political science from Santa Clara University, her JD from the University of Virginia. She is here tonight to present to you the UNM Sandia National Laboratory's Global Security Distinguished Lecture, Rising National Security Threats and Challenges in the Decade Ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome to the stage the Honorable Janet Napolitano.
Well, thank you, President. Can you all hear me? Yes. All right. It's great to be here. It's great to be back in Albuquerque, where I actually grew up. I went to Comanche Elementary School, Madison Junior High, Sandia High School, and it's also great to be here and hosted at the University of New Mexico, where my father served as dean of the medical school for more than 20 years. Is it just me, or does it feel like time is really speeding up? That every day we're having to do more with fewer hours. Maybe it was COVID, where everything seemed to slow down to kind of an eerie, homebound, Zoom-driven reality, in which you began to wonder if people had legs under those torsos. And then, boom, the Trump administration ended, the Biden administration began, COVID vaccines hit the streets. Suddenly, we were walking around again at full size instead of the digitized versions of ourselves that we saw from kitchens on computer screens. It has been a strange few years, and I think we have more strange ones ahead of us. We're all going to have to learn to deal with and grapple with a new reality, because I just don't see things slowing down anytime soon. So again, thank you for inviting me to be with you this evening. As was stated, my name's Janet Napolitano. I'm now a college professor at the UC Berkeley School of Public Policy. Berkeley is a pretty amazing place, I have to say. It pumps out Nobel laureates, nuclear fusion, new elements, and leading innovations in science, technology, engineering, public policy, physics, astronomy, all literally before we get out of bed to have breakfast in the morning. It's a remarkable place where you feel privileged just to walk around the campus. Let me share with you one anecdote. It's nice to win a Nobel Prize. You get a nice check, get a trip to Sweden. But you know what you get at Berkeley if you're a faculty member and you win a Nobel? A parking space. More valuable than gold. So, in addition to teaching a course on security policy, I founded an institute called the Berkeley Center for Security and Politics, focused on solving national problems at the nexus of security and politics. Little things like how search and social media have driven the American public into pockets of extremism that undermine our democratic institutions. How new technology provides great promise, but also great risks for our society. And what effects the implications of climate change may have on security requirements at home and abroad. Things like mass migration forced by drought, extreme weather, and the like. You know, these are the really easy problems we have to solve as a nation. And you'd think after more than 30 years in public service, I would have moved on to something more mundane, like practicing law again, or dog walking, or watercolor painting. I just couldn't do it. We have a lot of work to do as Americans to hold this democracy together, or we just might lose it. And I feel strongly that all of us, everybody in this auditorium tonight, if we put our minds to it, we can actually make a difference if we want to. Now, I've had the great pleasure and honor in my life of being the first at many things. I was the first woman elected Attorney General of Arizona, the only woman to serve as Attorney General and Governor of Arizona, first female chair of the National Governors Association, first female Secretary of Homeland Security, the first and only female president of the University of California, and I'm glad to see a woman as president here at UNM. Now, trust me, this is all kind of cool, but I think some of these firsts happen because I never focused on being first or an only of anything. Instead, I was the person who believed we could individually and collectively bring to reality the intent of our nation's framers, the intent to constantly evolve the United States into a more perfect union where we all had a shared commitment to something bigger, a common language, a common patriotism, a common direction of shared freedoms. But today, I worry that maybe some of those commonalities have begun to seriously erode, and that this erosion itself is a threat to our security. I'm not uninspired, and I'm definitely not undeterred, but I am here to say we all need to get back to being busy as citizens of this country, and not just as people working for the moment at the office, at home, or wherever. I know we are all busy with our jobs, our families, just living our lives. But it's time we look around and recognize that while we may not have everything in common with the person sitting next to us, we at least have a country and a set of freedoms in common that are a heck of a lot better than the freedoms afforded to two people sitting next to each other in Russia or Iran or China. So what's going on out there today? How did we get to this fractured space? How can we fix it? Let's start with the basics. Our nation's adversaries, both state actors and criminal actors funded by sovereigns, have been messing around in the United States for a long time. Some of their actions have involved modern inventions of our own creation, things like the internet, search and social media, that brought the world to us and us to them while opening up freedoms and information that had never previously been seen. And it also exposed huge and gaping vulnerabilities in American society. These vulnerabilities were exploited by our adversaries to divide this nation, and to divide it perniciously, using the tools of freedom, free speech, freedom of expression, to drive people into self-contained and mutually reinforcing pockets, where words, true or false, become fact, where fact becomes suspect. In 2016, for example, the Russians operated a sophisticated social influence campaign designed to support candidate Trump and denigrate candidate Clinton. They used fake U.S. identities and developed mock grassroots campaigns to host large rallies for candidate Trump. And if that weren't enough, they hacked the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign, dumping thousands of emails under the guise of Guccifer 2.0 and WikiLeaks. The social influence campaign, which continued through the 2020 election, was specifically designed to exacerbate social tensions within our country and to plant fake information about the integrity of our electoral system. At the same time as this disinformation campaign, the hum and churn of our free markets and our capital-based economy, which is the safest, most reliable, and best in the world, left many behind. Those people began to feel they had no hope, no upward mobility, no ability to achieve that to which every American aspires: the ability to leave things a little better for their children than had been left to them. I'm serious about this. People today, Americans today, actually believe they will leave their families and children in a worse condition than they were left by their parents. And for many, this, sadly enough, will actually be true. This is the first generation to think like this, to feel there's no longer any such thing as the American dream. Or if there is, it's an American dream for someone else, but not for them. That the hope once offered by our free enterprise, free thinking, and free acting experiment was an illusory one. And as our adversaries work to divide this nation, they read the same polls we all do in politics. And they took that information and started to feed it, to post it, to retweet it, put it on Instagram, pushing it into the information ecosystem to foment division and feeding American citizens mis- and disinformation that there is no hope, there is no American dream. Worse still, they sent out messaging that people who disagree are enemies, rather than simply two people on opposite sides of an issue, but still rowing in a common direction for the benefit of society. Let me put a finer point on this from a world I come from as the former Homeland Security Secretary and Governor of Arizona. The U.S. border with Mexico, U.S. border policy, and the Trump effect on border security. Donald Trump was elected and then governed on an anti-immigration, border wall building, immigrant bashing platform. It's a fact. I'm not here to judge what he said. His words are his constitutionally protected right to express himself, but just to lay out what he did say. But border walls from Brownsville, Texas to San Diego, California don't work, won't work, have never worked. The big, beautiful wall is only as big and beautiful as the next ladder that can be placed on it or the next tunnel that can be built under it. I used to say when I was governor, show me a 10-foot wall and I'll show you an 11-foot ladder. It's true. And I should know because it was my state, Arizona, where those walls were built and scaled in the George W. Bush administration, the Obama administration, and of course, the Trump administration. But here's the deal. You build walls or put physical infrastructure where it's needed, in population centers. And then you couple that with manpower and technology between those ports of entries where the population centers are. And you use manpower and technology in the unpopulated miles of the border. You don't build walls for 1,940 miles from the southern tip of Texas to the bottom of California. It's a waste of taxpayer dollars, and it's non-functional from a border enforcement perspective. But you add in smart enforcement policies from the U.S., the proper administration of immigration controls, and you can have good border policy. I think we had effective border and immigration policies in the Obama administration, and we were heavily criticized for it. We removed more criminals from the United States than at any time in our country's history, and we reduced apprehension rates by record numbers, and apprehension decreases mean fewer people are trying to cross illegally because we coupled our efforts with sound border management. I'm often asked if the border is out of control, and I hear all the stories about President Biden and his policies are the reason why immigrants are streaming across our border. People aren't streaming across our border. They're streaming to it, and most are detained here. Some are admitted to the country because they have asylum claims to make. And those who claim asylum are required under our law to enter the country and to have their asylum claims adjudicated. This isn't Biden law or Trump law or Obama law. It's just the law, and it's been that way for decades. And U.S. policy alone is never the driver of immigration flows. Conditions in countries south of the United States and around the world drive immigration flows, not U.S. border policy alone. But in today's world, where we are riven by division, did you know that some have labeled me a traitor because I said the border wall makes no sense? Did you know that anyone who opposes the border wall is un-American? Let me pause on this for a moment. I appeared recently on a treason list that was published by a credible statewide Republican candidate for Secretary of State in Arizona. At the very time I was being accused of treason by that candidate, he's from the far right, I've been labeled the deporter-in-chief by the far left for removing so many people from the country when I was the DHS secretary. Now, both of those things can't simultaneously be true. And as a matter of fact, I'm not a traitor for exercising my First Amendment right to express my opinion about an ill-advised policy related to construction of a border wall. Nor am I the deporter-in-chief for doing the job I once had, the job of following statutes enacted by Congress, mandating responsibilities to the Secretary of Homeland Security under law and on behalf of the American people. But this is really a description of the kind of dichotomous problems we're facing. Opinions by definition aren't facts. Facts by definition aren't opinions. But we're living in a time where opinions are treated as facts, and facts are viewed as opinions to which an alternative set of facts can be applied, which of course are just another set of opinions. You know, a famous politician once said, if you see a turtle on a fence post, you know he didn't get there by himself. Turtle on a fence post. I translate that as loosely meaning if you see something that is contrary to nature, it didn't happen on its own. Well, we are that turtle on that proverbial fence post. And as that prairie wisdom suggests, we did not get here by ourselves. As I said earlier, our adversaries have been working at putting us on that fence post for years. They've been doing it at scale and have been endeavoring to usher in a new world order for a long time. Nowhere can this be seen as clearly as in the prequel to the war in Ukraine and the waging of that horribly tragic conflict in Europe. Just look at what Vladimir Putin said over and over in the lead up to his invasion of Ukraine. Time and again, the official position of the Kremlin was that the buildup of troops along Ukraine's border was a military exercise. Even as the U.S. intelligence community released factual and countervailing information illustrating that Putin intended to invade, the Kremlin denied those intentions over and over. And then several weeks later, we witnessed that long column of Russian tanks rolling toward Kyiv and initiating direct conflict. Now, 7 months later, Ukraine is in a pitched battle for its independence, and few are discussing the fact that Russia exercised misdirection, outright falsification, and fabrication in its early rhetoric about its intentions. There's rightfully much discussion about the Russian atrocities being committed in Ukraine, but again, precious little about their ongoing attempts to misdirect and lie about those atrocities. Indeed, the Russian facts tell us that it is the Ukrainians committing the atrocities. What the Kremlin is hoping for, and what they are counting on, and what they have said they expect, is that Russia will be able to win a war of attrition against the West and the United States. Putin has outright said that he doubts America has the resolve or the attention span to stick by Ukraine in the long term, because he believes that as a nation, we are easily distracted and that we have no patience for the long term. He's counting on that, And he was planning for it long ago when the Russians and others began their information operations in the U.S. domestic theater, utilizing our tools such as search and social media and subversive campaigns in mainstream media, developing and paying for scholarship and media commentary designed to divide our country, and with the express intent of teaching, encouraging, even training the U.S. public to have no patience for the long fight, no common framework with each other, and a limited capacity to share a national purpose. You don't take my word for it, though. Just read Putin's words in black and white. The war in Ukraine and whether the West and the U.S. have the resolve to stand by Ukraine has direct implications for our reputation around the world, but most notably for China, and particularly with respect to Taiwan. It's not groundbreaking or even newsworthy for me to say that China is paying very close attention to how America responds and continues to respond to the war in Ukraine. The resolve of the West in Ukraine speaks quite directly to what our resolve might be with respect to an invasion of Taiwan by China. Now, first, let me be clear. Any conflict that could arise between the world's two superpowers as it relates to Taiwan is good for neither superpower. What is of mutual interest to the United States and China is that both nations constructively engage each other, recognizing that each have legitimate grievances with the other, and that both should work together to try to mitigate those grievances and focusing on shared interests. That said, the United States has a moral imperative to support freedom and democracy, coupled with a strategic interest in promoting the same throughout the globe. Taiwan is a democracy, and a democracy with which we have deep cultural and economic ties. At the same time, we do have the one China policy, and this certainly creates a pickle for managing exchanges with Taiwan, including official visits. It's axiomatic that no other country in the world has the right to tell us where we can and cannot promote freedom and democracy, or where we can and cannot engage in diplomacy. We have a sovereign right to decide that for ourselves. Yep, I'm saying I believe the recent trip by Speaker Nancy Pelosi and other high-ranking delegations to Taiwan were appropriate. Predictably, following those visits, China had an outsized reaction. This included military exercises in the Strait of Taiwan, overheated rhetoric about a violation of world order, and a very strong exclamation that the Pelosi trip was a hostile gesture by the United States government. The Chinese ambassador to the United States wrote a really interesting piece in the Washington Post, likening the visit by Speaker Pelosi to Taiwan to a visit by President Xi to a United States state. In that piece, the ambassador effectively argued that no Chinese head of government would visit a U.S. state without approval and coordination by the U.S. government, and that by sending the third in line of succession to the presidency to Taiwan, the President of the United States had violated the sovereignty of China. I found that argument fascinating and wrong. First of all, the Chinese have spent the better part of the past 4 decades studying, learning, and appropriating the most intricate details of U.S. life, policy, technology, and government. You'd have thought they would know that while the Speaker is the third in line in succession, she runs a separate but co-equal branch of the U.S. government. You would have expected the ambassador to have a sense that we are a federal system, unlike China, where a central government does not control everything from top to bottom. President Biden could not more have prevented Speaker Pelosi from that trip than I can dunk on LeBron James. But the messaging in the United States by the ambassador was all designed to further divide Americans from themselves and from the trust they once had in their government and government leaders. Pelosi was either out of control or sent by Biden. Biden was either hapless or helpless, or he sent Pelosi. Her visit was either a subversive message on behalf of the United States, or the United States government was falling apart because it isn't coordinated. Each version of the truth is a nugget for Fox News to do one thing with and CNN to do another. And not to mention what was happening on social media. Which brings me back to where I began. We, all of us, from the President of the United States to business leaders, everyday people, we're dealing with a whole new world, one that's faster, one in which channels of communication are no longer separated by continent, by time, space, distance, one in which an unspoken rule of decency, fundamental fair play, and a dash of respect was underlying the healthy competition between adversaries. Today, war is waged by our adversaries in the civilian space in the United States. And while there may be no current physical death toll to account for the battle being waged, there are things our adversaries are successfully attacking in the United States. A sense of unity of purpose, a common patriotism, a belief in our fellow Americans to do the right thing with each other, even if we disagree, a love and understanding of country. Just the rage the general public feels against political leaders is a good example. Somewhere along the line, Americans have been deceived into believing that the government is against them, instead of being a government that exists by the consent of the governed. If you want to see a great speech that all Americans should watch, go back and look at Al Gore's concession speech in 2000. In that race, during the Florida recount and leading up to the Supreme Court decision to end the recount, the Gore campaign had some legitimate arguments about why counting should continue. The Supreme Court, at the time, with 5 Republicans, 4 Democrat appointees, rejected Gore's arguments. Now, Gore could have potentially done what Donald Trump did in fomenting the January 6th insurrection, but he didn't. He demonstrated to the country what the rule of law meant, what trust in our democratic institution meant, and what it meant to be an American, above all, what that meant. This is the type of lesson I'm trying to teach out of my center at Berkeley. And I understand that it's the type of thing that you're trying to teach out of this center here at UNM. These are the types of challenges we're trying to solve for there. But this needs to be a whole of country effort. So tonight I've spoken with you about some of the major security challenges confronting the United States. Election interference by the Russians designed to foment social division. The need to defend Ukraine, how to manage our tensions with China. I'd like to add 2 more security challenges our country must confront. The challenges arising from cybersecurity and the challenges arising from global warming. From a homeland security perspective, cybersecurity was our fastest growing area of concern. When I became the DHS secretary in 2009, I spent maybe 10% of my time on cyber-related matters. By the time I left in 2013, it was a good 40% of my time. And now, DHS is home to CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. CISA is charged with protecting the nation's critical infrastructure, our power grids, our water treatment plants, our election systems, from successful cyber attacks. And CISA is just one of many federal agencies with responsibilities in the cyber arena. The perpetrators can be state actors, non-state actors, and cyber criminals. The FBI reports that the number of ransomware attacks increased 62% just last year alone in the United States. But cyber is an area where the law is often unclear and where public policy is similarly opaque. It's an area where it will be essential for the public and private sectors to work together. And it's an area where international cooperation is key because, as we all know, cyber does not itself respect national boundaries. International cooperation is also essential for the second security challenge I'd like to mention, global warming. Yes, we must do absolutely all we can to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the standard set by the Paris Accord. But we also need to improve our adaptation, our resilience to the effects of the warming that has already occurred. These include changing weather patterns, changes to extreme weather events, food security, water security, changes to human migration patterns. Global warming presents a series of existential risks, and it's an area that requires a greater sense of global urgency than it has yet been given. Now, none of the security challenges I've discussed with you tonight are without historical precedent. The Brits, for example, are reported to have conducted their own election interference campaign in the United States in connection with the presidential election of 1940. It's just that their interference was designed to encourage the election of Franklin Roosevelt, who was not an isolationist in comparison to his Republican opponent. None of the security challenges I've discussed with you tonight are without solutions. But the solutions must be data-based and evidence-driven. They will require the best efforts of all of us, whether you're a Cal Bear or a UNM Lobo. We have much to do if we are to secure our world and protect our democracy. And failure is simply not an option. So with that, I thank you for letting me be with you today, and I'm happy to take whatever questions you have. Thank you.
We have a microphone. One of these problems.
Microphones are also part of the technology challenges facing our world today. There's probably a button in the bottom.
We have a microphone if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary, for the excellent speech you gave tonight. My question pertains to the National Security Strategy that was just published, I think today or yesterday.
Yesterday.
And in that, the strategy focuses basically on three aspects: China, Russia, and democratic values. So where do you see some of the main challenges that you raised fit in those three major objectives of that national strategy? Thank you.
Well, first, let me just say, I haven't read the strategy yet. I think that's tonight's homework, maybe tomorrow's. But China, Russia, and defense of democratic values, those, to me, all make sense as the areas of strategic prioritization with the United States. But they take different forms. In Russia, we're in a kinetic war. The challenge is both military and diplomatic. The challenge is to keep the alliances together, the EU, NATO, the other countries of the world who voted in the General Assembly just this past week by a huge majority to condemn Russia's annexation of the provinces in Ukraine. And that will require just a consistency, to me, of effort. We need to keep supplying Ukraine with arms and training and the like. We need to identify what support we can give to EU countries that are going to be energy deprived during this cold winter. What help can we provide there? With China, first of all, China it's a much more massive country than Russia. Russia has an economy the size of Spain's. It's the 15th or 16th ranked economy in the world. If it didn't have oil or gas, it wouldn't have much. China, of course, is a behemoth. We will not be able to address climate change without China. We will not be able to promote global economic growth without China. And vice versa. They won't be able to do those things without us. So to me, there is a huge value in addressing China at a different level than Russia, while at the same time making sure that the Chinese understand our position with respect to Taiwan, and to look at how we have been able to work with Ukraine to fight back Russia. And, does China want to be in the same quagmire? I don't think so. The democratic values one is, and I spent a lot of time in my talk tonight talking about that, because in my mind, that in a way is almost the most dangerous security risk facing us, because it really undercuts our sense of who we are as a country, as a people. We've gotten so hyper-partisan, hyper-polarized. The media, social media, mainstream media, whatever, people absorb the media that they agree with, and if you don't agree with it, then it's not right? Facts, things that are proven and provable are not believed. Election denialism is rampant, undercutting faith in the integrity of our electoral system. And I think that as a country, we have yet to figure out really how to deal with this. What role the social media platforms should play. Do they have a responsibility to moderate content or moderate it more than they have? Should they be immune from liability as they currently are. And I think this is an area where the public sector and the private sector are going to have to struggle together to try to get the world back into some sort of a tolerable position.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm Sylvia Saltstein from Sandia National Labs, and I lead a group working on nuclear energy and nuclear waste. And I would like to ask you a question that many people have been asking me that I don't have an answer for. And so I would love your insight. We at Sandia, we do a lot of analysis on the safety of nuclear power plants and the safety of nuclear waste, and what consequences there could be in any type of situation. We don't design nuclear power plants or any other manufacturing facility or energy facility to survive military conflict. And so we have been doing a lot of analysis in what-if scenarios about the nuclear power plants in Ukraine and the nuclear waste in Ukraine. And people ask me, is Putin going to bomb the nuclear power plants? Would he do that? He's already done things that we, 6 months ago thought were inconceivable. And so I'm just wondering what your insight is so that I could be a little more informed when I'm asked these questions.
If I could get in Putin's brain for just a few minutes, I might have a better answer for you. But I think we're dealing with a situation with a world leader who's a human being that we don't completely understand. We can estimate, we can do risk analyses, we can do war gaming, etc., play through different types of scenarios. But in the end, he is the leader who will decide what he is going to do. I think with respect to nuclear power plants, I think in a world where climate change is here and the world is warming at a tremendous rate, in my view, and I know some of you may not agree with this, but in my view, there is a role for nuclear power. And we need to deal with both the military issue that you described and also the waste issue, which we also have not solved. And in terms of the military approach, I think what the focus ought to be is on how do we build plants that are militarily defensible? How do we build plants that don't have a sole source of failure, so that you can't just take out a plant by taking out the power system to the plant. And then finally, what do we do to anticipate and mitigate the risk of any type of attack on a nuclear plant? So, so that's, it's a problem, right? It's a problem set. We got to work the problem. That's why we need scientists.
Thank you.
Just some thoughts.
I'm Ken Carpenter, and I work in a Global National Security Policy Institute. You have long experience working both at the local and state levels and also at the federal government levels. We generally assume that national security policy is the responsibility of the federal government, but what level of responsibility do state and local officials and policymakers have? And how do you create partnerships between federal officials and state and local officials?
So I think you're right in terms of security policy that is generally viewed as more federal than state or local. However, it is state and local's responsibility to protect the public safety of the citizenry within the state, right? I think a couple of things. One is, I think the federal government ought to pay more attention to the nation's governors. Governors have the day in, day out responsibility for setting the agenda for a state, et cetera. There ought to be a more institutionalized cooperation framework for that kind of coordination to occur between, say, the National Governors Association and the NSC. More than just one meeting a year, but a really organic, institutionalized approach. The second thing is one area of public safety that falls heavily on state and local authorities is disaster response. So everybody always assumes that FEMA is the first in, whereas in reality, in our federal system, it's really locals and states who are the first in, and FEMA comes in as if the state and local assets are overwhelmed. And it also comes in with respect to the insurance payments that it funds out of something called the DERF. So I think getting greater public awareness and clarity on that division of labor, I think is important, actually.
This might go in and out a little bit, but thank you so much for your talk tonight. Early on in your discussion with us, you mentioned that all of us have a role in this. When I look around the room, and I look around many rooms, and I see most of us are over 30. Your students, I would assume, may range in the 20s and the 30s age group, but many of us being over 30, many of us working with 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds, and being neighbors and being community members and being professors and being leaders of organizations. What can we really do? Is there a little something that you might suggest to us as individuals working with others and being in the community? Is there a little something that we can do, as you mentioned earlier in your talk?
Yeah, I think there's a lot people can do. First of all, politics is not a dirty word. It can be a full body contact sport, but it's not a dirty word. To think about not merely voting, but find a candidate or two that you like and work on a campaign and get out there and talk to your fellow citizens, the folks in a legislative district, for example, a city council race. That's one. Number two is reach out to community nonprofits. There's a very robust nonprofit sector in the United States, and it does a lot of different things. Some of it is providing emergency services. Some of it is providing training and education. Some of it is working on things like climate resilience and adaptation. If you can find it within yourself to identify an organization that you want to spend some of your personal time on, I think that's of high value as well.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. My name is Kathy Simonson. I recently retired from the Global Security Division at Sandia. So my question, I think I really would appreciate your perspective as someone who still thinks very deeply about national and international security, but who also has a background in elective politics.
Can you speak up? I'm sorry, I can't hear.
What my question is, it looks to me as though, as divided as our populace is, our elected leaders are even more divided. And they seem to focus most of their time and energy not on the perhaps 80% of things where we primarily agree, but on the small percentage of hot button issues that separate us. Are there things that we can do to try to bring back a little more bipartisanship within our elected officials? Because I think in some ways, yes, the Russians certainly try to divide us, but I think our Congress does the same thing. And then how do we address that? I'd love your perspectives.
Yeah, so such a good question. Because you really want to say when you're back in D.C., can't we all just get along? And it gets wrapped up in the hyper-partisanship that is itself a product of the communications on social media and the amount of just plain misinformation out there, and the lack of kind of a unified, trusted source for information. I think, one very, it sounds simple, but I think it would not be without impact, would be to, when a member of Congress who purports to represent you misbehaves, call them on it. Write a letter to the editor. They read that stuff. And for a constituent to take the time and effort to do something like that, and can we expect to revolutionize the system, by doing something like that? No, but you can begin to help move the needle a little bit at a time. So think strategically about what your elected officials, what they respond to, and then hit them there.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for your really important speech. My name is Nate Matthews-Trigg. I'm a climate change and health security researcher at the University of Washington. So my question is very climate change related. So the United Nations recently came out and said, The United Nations recently said there's a 50% chance of reaching the 1.5 degree threshold within a decade. Knowing that if we surpass that threshold, critical natural ecosystems in the global south will collapse, causing millions, hundreds of millions of people to move north. How do you suggest approaching that challenge from a border security perspective?
Yeah, so I think it is highly possible that we will see mass migration from south to north globally as the climate warms. Why? Because people's crops will fail, their water sources will fail, their economies will fail, their institutions of government will fail, and people will go where they think they can live and live safely. And I think that's already being seen at our southwest border. And, you know, I think one approach that we should be pursuing with more urgency now is working with the countries of, say, the Northern Triangle and South America on resilience and adaptation strategies that focus on climate change, which tie into the root causes for why people pick up and leave their homes.
Yes, hello. Casey Keene, Sandia. So you correctly note, I believe, the manipulation of perception is a really key danger to national security. I'm curious as to your specific thoughts on TikTok, actually. Noting that the majority, or certainly the plurality, trending towards the majority of people in the age 15 to 25 use TikTok as their primary source of news and information.
Which should scare all of us.
Yes. And given its country of origin and the atomized nature of not being able to track what is distributed to those individual users, I'm curious as your perspective on what the appropriate level of government intervention is in that arena, and also how is that balanced against American ideals of freedom of speech and expression. Thank you.
Yeah, so, you know, TikTok is not a special case. I mean, it's special in the sense that so many young people get their news from TikTok. But it's the same issue that you have with Meta, that you have with Twitter and YouTube, et cetera. And I think that the fight needs to be with the owners of these platforms. They have a greater civic responsibility than they have been willing to exercise. I know that they need to make money. We live in a capitalist society. Get it. However, we live in a society where we all have to depend on each other too. And so I think looking at, for example, amending or reforming Section 230 of the Community Decency Act, which is what is the liability shield, that may bring these social media giants to the table.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll take one more question, I guess. One more hand. Perfect.
Hi, I'm Will Ito, retired Foreign Service officer. I just spent the last week in Aspen with a group of Foreign Service professionals, mid-career folks. And the ones that serve overseas are having a tough time these days, and that is that the reputation of the United States has really kind of plummeted. And some of the advantages that my generation had of representing a country that was idealized by so many others, that reputation has been greatly tarnished. Mishandling of COVID, for example, the January 6th attack on the Capitol. What can we do to try to, once again, maybe recapture the high ground and try to, once again, establish the United States as sort of a moral example that other countries can try to follow?
You know, I think actually how we have handled the Ukraine invasion is, for my friends who are in the Foreign Service station, it is helping that international perception of the United States. The fact that we shared intelligence, accurate intelligence, we shared it early. The fact that we have put billions of dollars into arms for Ukraine. The fact that we have exercised a leadership position with respect to the EU, NATO, and this past week, the UN. All of that helps. All of that helps resuscitate international perceptions of the United States and the values that we have.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all for attending. Appreciate your interest in listening to the Secretary speak. Have a good evening.